Ready to go? So this past summer, my wife and I planned this mini civil rights trip. It was not very long, only less than a week actually. But despite the modest nature of this trip to various sites along the freedom struggle, it was profound. There's real power in those places. So visiting the sites that I'd only read about in history museums, because it was the first time I went, I've been teaching history for all my life, I was surprised by both the horror that it stirred up and the inspiration that it gave me. Now, I've taught about the darkness and the racism and the light of resistance, as I said, for most of my life. But for me, the darkness is outweighed by the light, by the inspiration. I find strength in stories of resistance and liberation, especially when they're told by Black Americans who, for 400 years, have personified courage and persistence and idealism. So I think they bring out the best of our country. They convey, to me, a deep honoring of democracy, even for a country that didn't honor them. These were the stories that I sought out when I was a civil rights tourist this summer. So take a look at these pamphlets, consider a trip yourself. Now, I'll admit, I'm not real comfortable with the term civil rights tourism. Some people talked about it as being a part of dark tourism, which is travel to spaces full of death and tragedy, like Auschwitz or the 9/11 Memorial. And though this travel is, in and of itself, not problematic, dark tourism can imply a superficial, morbid voyeurism, in a way, that lacks respect for those who suffered and died. It can pander to our unseemly human tendency to dwell on scenes of devastation and suffering, like when you drive by a car accident and you slow down to get a good look. Now, some might say that my sharing experiences as a civil rights tourist is mainly a demonstration of virtue signaling, right? Virtue signaling is the practice of publicly sharing opinions or deeds primarily to demonstrate one's own ethical virtue. Now, while I guard against this, I know I'm not above it. I mean, we all want to be seen as being ethical people. So if it's part of my motive, I can live with that humbling admission, because we're flawed creatures. But I hope that my teaching about racial justice is mainly to foster constructive conversation about deconstructing racism for the benefit, especially of folks of color, but for all Americans. So today I'm going to start by speaking about climbing up Georgia's Stone Mountain, crossing the bridge into Selma, and standing on a hilltop overlooking Montgomery. So I'm going to first share about a more brutal history, by going to first Stone Mountain, and then to Selma, and then to Montgomery. Then I'm going to go in reverse order and talk a little bit more about the light from Montgomery to Selma to Stone Mountain. I hope this shows how we as a nation can process more thoroughly the darkness in order to get to the light. Censorship of history denies us access to sources of inspiration. Now, this view was incredible on the top of Stone Mountain when I went with my friend and my wife. You could see in every direction through that summer haze. Atlanta was visible to the west. But I knew that below us, on its granite face, was the world's largest monument to white supremacy. Carved in bas-relief, 40 feet deep, the images of three notorious heroes of the Confederacy were there: Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson. Now, they were carved on a mountain where, on November 25th, 1915, William Simmons and his hooded followers lit crosses and celebrated the rebirth of the KKK. And we can just leave them on, I think. I think it's easier, because when you turn them off, they don't always come back on. Well, there are only about 10 more slides, so we're just going to leave that up there. So the rebirth of the Klan occurred on the top of that mountain. Now, demands for the memorial to these Confederate leaders began decades earlier when Carolyn Helen Plain, a leader of Georgia's chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, began to advocate for it. Now, originally, the UDC, United Daughters of the Confederacy, was founded so that the widows could be helped maintaining their husbands' grave sites. That was why it started right after the Civil War. But over the years, the UDC's missions expanded to include veneration of the Confederacy through historical distortion and these memorials. Now, thanks to Plain, in 1923, just 2 years before she died, Gunston Borglum began carving the likenesses of these defenders of slavery. Construction problems and issues with funds shrinking led him to leave the project, and in 1923 he left to go, a little after that, to carve Mount Rushmore. Carver Rushmore. So despite claims by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the monument was never about the Civil War. Nothing actually happened at Stone Mountain during the Civil War. No great battle. The monument was about racism. This is why in the 1950s, as the Civil Rights Movement began to gain traction, Southern backlash renewed interest in the memorial. To reassert white supremacy, many Southerners embraced a historical revisionism. They distorted our collective memories and crafted narratives about virtuous and gallant Southerners defending and protecting civilization. And this echoed through one of the most popular films in United States history, about a decade and a half before the whole project begun, Birth of a Nation. If you see Birth of a Nation, which was subtitled or originally titled The Klansman, you'll know what I'm talking about. And Zia, feel free to stay. Little space, I'll just talk over it, I'll talk louder. So this film portrayed the war between the states as a heroic defense of all that was noble and good. Southern apologists wanted to see Davis and Lee and Jackson as the holy trinity of the Confederacy. Now, Marvin Griffin, who was the governor of Georgia from 1955 to 1959, did all he could to win over people lusting for this recrafted narrative. He was the person who put the rebel battle flag on the state flag of Georgia in the 50s. He renewed the Stone Mountain Project. Now, Brent Legs, who's with the African American Heritage Cultural Action Fund, said that Griffin wanted to, quote, weaponize art in order to prop up white supremacy. Stone Mountain Park, the most visited of all of Georgia's tourist sites, was a psychological weapon designed to suppress the progress of Black Americans. It was a weapon that supported violence towards civil rights activists, including those who crossed Selma's famous Edmund Pettus Bridge. Now, when I got to Selma, I wondered if years ago the police officers who cracked the heads of those peaceful protesters had visited Stone Mountain. Were they affected by this weaponized art? Did they revere the holy trinity of the Confederacy? Did it help them justify beating innocent citizens for demanding the right to vote? Now, Selma was one of the epicenters of the voting rights movement, as well was Lowndes County, which sits right between Montgomery and Selma. It was known as Bloody Lowndes for the brutality of the oppression there. And for decades, less violent methods were working fine in the South, like subjectively administered voter registration tests. To register for vote, for example, many Black citizens had to guess how many jelly beans were inside of a pickle jar. So no wonder that in 1940, in a state where 43% of the people were Black Americans, the percentages of Black voting age people registered to vote was less than 0.5%. So our first stop in Selma was on the east side of the bridge that arcs over the Alabama River. right here, I told my wife, right here. I was on the other side of it. That was the bridge, but I saw the spot, because I had taught about this enough, where right on Route 80, John Lewis and his other marchers were beaten by state troopers. About 100 white spectators cheered on the violence on what became known as Bloody Sunday. Journalists documented the horrors, and photos of Lewis brought to his knees were spread around the world. And visible behind Lewis and his attackers is Hastings Mattress and Awning Company, a building that today houses the National Voting Rights Museum, which we visited at the end of our day in Selma. First, though, we marched over the bridge, a bridge named for Edmund Pettus, a former U.S. Senator, Confederate General, and Grand Dragon of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan. That's still the name of the bridge. At the height of the bridge span, I looked down at the river, the Alabama River, far below. It was full and muddy and swiftly flowing south and towards the Gulf of Mexico. And I just thought to myself, how much blood drawn from the lashes of people carted on slave boats up the river to Montgomery slave markets flowed through those waters. There's something about a river, how it's always the same and always changing. It was that river that carried those indentured folks. So when we went up to Montgomery, we went to the site of these slave markets, and they were some of the busiest of the nation. Just steps from where human beings were auctioned off to the highest bidder, now stands the Legacy Museum, which is a project of Bryan Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative. It speaks to the head and the heart, offering new information while humanizing victims of slavery and racism. But it was another of Stevenson's related projects that really affected me the most, and that was the National Memorial to Peace and Justice, which was on a hill overlooking Montgomery. Now, colloquially known as the Lynching Museum, it features over 800 steel columns, most suspended from above. Each column represents one county where documented lynchings occurred. On each column is etched the names of victims who were publicly and cruelly tortured and murdered. In acts of racial terrorism, the total of names were 4,000. Many more remain undocumented. Now, along a walk recommended through the memorial, the first columns you run into are mounted on the ground. They greet you face to face, so to speak. One column I saw commemorated Elias Clayton, Ias McGee, and Elmer Jackson, and they were lynched by a mob of 10,000 people in 1920. Now, the fact that this mob gathered in Duluth, Minnesota, underlines the fact that racism in America was not confined to the South. And that's why this is a national memorial to peace and justice. Now, we know that mob violence was not merely the spontaneous outbursts of angry people, because our whole system, including the police and civic authorities, allowed this extra-legal violence. Only 1% of lynchings committed after 1900 led to a criminal conviction. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, such sanctioned brutality, quote, created enduring national and institutional wounds that have not yet healed. Lynchings occurred in communities where African Americans today remain marginalized, disproportionately poor, overrepresented in prisons and jails, and underrepresented in decision-making roles in the criminal justice system, end quote. Now, walking through the memorial down a slight slope, steel columns, which were hung from the ceiling at that point, seemed to rise above me as you went down. They're transformed into gruesome symbols of the thousands of human beings hung from their necks. I was visibly shaken by these suspended columns that hung like bodies. Now, while this horror seared into my heart, the memorial offers opportunities for inspiration and healing and dignity. It acknowledges the darkness while simultaneously shedding light on our path forward. Now, while Stevenson acknowledged that the columns rise as you walk, as if somebody is being strung up, he adds, they also ascend. Looking up at the columns, I felt they sanctified the determination and sacrifices of so many. And I left the memorial inspired, believing that only when we confront the darkness do we bring forth the light. Brian Stevenson put it well. He said, our nation's history of racial injustice casts a shadow across the American landscape. This shadow cannot be lifted until we shine the light of truth on the destructive violence that shaped our nation, traumatized people of color, and compromised our commitment to the rule of law and to equal justice. And after all, it's the light that attracts people from all around the country to a memorial dedicated to lynching. How are you going to bring people in if there's not that light? This was certainly true for descendants of victims of lynching. One was Faye Walker Howell. Her distant cousin, Wes Johnson, was lynched in 1937 in Tumbleton, Alabama. And acknowledging this tragedy pays tribute to both Johnson and to the truth. The liberatory power of truth is etched in words on the headstone at Johnson's gravesite. And they come from John 8:32. They read, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Now, the Equal Justice Initiative Memorial offers truth and freedom. Truth about our history and freedom from the lies. But it gave me much more than that. It hit me deeply. It felt, for an atheist, as close to a spiritual experience as I can get. Entering the 6-acre site that morning, you passed through metal detectors, and the security guards were announcing, no food, no drink, and no selfies. I thought, no selfies? Wondered about that. Then an obvious and horrific truth came to me. A century ago, postcards commemorating lynchings were sold as souvenirs. They portrayed the smiling white faces in front of these gruesome backdrops, and I felt a bit ashamed of my fleeting intention to click a selfie next to a steel slab. The security guard added, this is a sacred space. And I nodded. I thought, yeah, maybe this place is not as much for tourists as it is for pilgrims, in a way. Now, greeting us just past the entrance is a sculpture of 6 changed victors, one with a babe in arms, by Ghanaian artist Kwame Akoto Bamfo. And his work, most of it's done in his Ghanaian studio, connects racism to Western imperialism, because this is a broader story than just our national story, and it offers a context, a human context, to the commodification of people. The shackles in a lot of his sculptures were modeled over once found real chains found in the Cape Coast slave castle in Africa. And the distinguishing marks and hairstyle of the various people in this sculpture indicate a diversity of backgrounds. The figures represent many regions because the system of slavery reached far and wide, and that was the artist's intention. But the horror was not just systemic, it was also personal and individual. So each person is unique. Each face conveys this many shades of reactions to enslavement, to agony, grief, despair, resignation. The individuality of each person is there because the artist said he wanted white people, quote, to see the figures as human beings and not black people. So he combined the universality of humanity with the particularity to convey our shared humanity. All the humans portrayed in chains, as well as those contemporary tourists visiting the memorial, walk what Akoto Bamfo called the path that leads to lynching. So as you go by his statue, you end up going to the parts where the bodies are hanging, in a way. Now, as I said, this felt like a spiritual experience, even though it was a very secular memorial. A lot of the people there felt that too, because so many of them were walking alone or speaking in hushed tones. And while I was next to people, I found myself drawn inwards to a meditation about both the darkness and the light. They came together in a powerful, reconciling sense of redemption, which is why I chose the last song for my sing-along today that I did. Redemption was part of the power of that place. Reconciliation is what Stevenson's reaching for in the memorial. Not a shallow reconciliation of just saying, oh, the past is past, so let's move on. Not a shallow reconciliation on avoiding the truth to escape uncomfortable feelings. He says that the reconciliation and the redemption requires work to heal and to redeem us all. He knows we have to do this work together, and that's why he emphasizes what is obvious but rarely discussed. The fact that racism damages everyone, people on all sides. Etched on one wall of the memorial are these words: white people who witnessed, participated in, and socialized their children in a culture that tolerated gruesome lynchings were also psychologically damaged. And that sense of inclusion helps bring people in together to heal our nation. The artistic beauty also helps in the healing. The sculptures, the landscaping, the words etched in various locations offers everyone a chance for honesty and some solace. The writer Toni Morrison understood that in a nation which often ignores their plight, many Black Americans are left to heal themselves. Her words on one wall set forth the prize that is to be gained. Morrison, who has Black people in mind in this passage, but is for all of us to hear, she says, "And oh, my people out yonder, hear me. They do not love your neck, unnoosed and straight. So love your neck. Put a hand on it, grace it, stroke it, and hold it up. And all your inside parts that they just as soon slop for hogs, you go to love them. The dark, dark liver, love it, and the beat and beating heart. Love that too. More than ever, eyes and feet, more than lungs that have yet to breathe fresh air, free air. More than your life-holding womb and your life-giving private parts, hear me now, love your heart, for this is the prize." These are prizes everyone can seize. The lessons taught there in Montgomery are open to everybody, should be spread across the United States. From that city where Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as the first president of the Confederacy, from a state in which the Governor George Wallace in 1963 said, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And from that hilltop overlooking Montgomery, Stevenson offers opportunities for redemption, and one very concrete one, because the memorial encourages people across the nation to acknowledge each and every one of the 4,000 individuals, to commemorate them with markers back in the counties where they were lynched. Will all the counties honor the victims as part of their work towards truth and reconciliation? Many have, but standing in their way are more than 700 monuments, including Stone Mountain, that glorify the rebels' cause. Some of those lynched had to walk by those very memorials before they were killed. So the hope is to replace in those counties, to place those markers. So if you live in a county that you know that there are documented lynchings, find out if there's a marker to each of the victims. And you can contact the Equal Justice Initiative and their Community Remembrance Project to honor those killed in the counties, to spread the message so it's not just in Montgomery. But so many still idealize the Confederacy, like in Selma. During the 50th anniversary of that famous march over the bridge on Bloody Sunday, the Friends of Forrest erected a billboard glorifying Nathan Bedford Forrest, slave trader and the first grand wizard of the KKK. They should have honored Mr. George Sally. I met him as I stepped off the bridge into the city of Selma. He still bears a scar on his forehead caused by a state trooper's billy club. That was on Bloody Sunday in 1965. Now, he served in our nation's military, but it was in his hometown that he was wounded. He spoke to my wife and I about being proud of being honored as the, quote, oldest foot soldier of the voting rights movement. In 2015, he was able to march alongside President Obama on that 50th anniversary celebration. Now, before we left Selma, we visited the National Voting Rights Museum next to where John Lewis was beaten. And it features the history of nonviolent protest that was passed on from Gandhi to Martin Luther King to today's civil rights activists. Nonviolent training prepares foot soldiers to expose injustice by giving up their bodies for the cause. There were plaster casts of the footprints of foot soldiers, actual foot soldiers from that day on the wall of the museum. And their sacrifice led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Now, we should hold up those black Americans and white Americans who sacrificed and instilled in us this belief that we could have justice for all. So I urge you to support the National Voting Rights Museum. It's a very modest museum, so that these stories of the foot soldiers can continue to be told. I was eager to go to that museum to support it, but it was harder to justify going into Stone Mountain Park. I was paying an entrance fee to a state-owned park proudly displaying weaponized art that continues attracting hate groups today. That park even had to close once in 2021 when hate groups were there and violence began to be a potential. For years, hateful symbols like the Confederate battle flag were right at the start of the hike up Stone Mountain. Some in Stone Mountain Village, which is 85% African American, were deeply insulted and harmed by those flags. Now, currently, the granite etchings protected legally, but the narrative around it has to be told truthfully. Taxpayer dollars should not promote glorification and racism. Maybe the personal sacrifice of the Confederate soldiers can be honored at their grave sites, keeping them up. But we have to stop valorizing the Confederate cause at national and state monuments. Cynthia Neal Spence of Spelman College put it this way. She talked about the Confederates saying, they fought valiantly to hold on to an inhumane system, and that's something we cannot celebrate. So those demanding racial justice and honest history organized the Stone Mountain Action Coalition. This is a grassroots movement urging everybody to make Stone Mountain Park more inclusive, and it focuses on telling the truth so that there can be more room for healing, transformation, and progress. So members call on the removal of Confederate flags completely, renaming park features that are currently named in honor of Confederates and Klan members, and changing Georgia's law that require the park to serve as a Confederate memorial. They succeeded in getting the flags moved from the start of the trail that we went up, so they called it a partial victory, but a victory nonetheless. I went to the gift store and I was glad to see that there were no Confederate flags being sold, which there have been. The new managers of the park, Thrive Attractions, is at least talking the talk. Their owner, Michael Dabrowski, said he wanted to ensure that the park is, quote, a welcoming and inclusive environment for all visitors from Atlanta, the nation, and the world. And there's a plan to develop an exhibit that'll tell a more complete story of the carving of the art. Much of that story is told in a short film called Monument, and I highly recommend it. For me, though, one of the most inspiring aspects of Stone Mountain was when climbing this 700-foot trail, most of the people on the trail, or at least half, were people of color. Now, I'm not sure how many of them were focused on the political battles about the depictions of the Confederacy, but it did strike me that almost everyone hiking that summit for exercise or tourism was, in a sense, reclaiming the mountain. They were taking it back from the clan members who desecrated it over a century ago. I want to conclude with some final reflections on my civil rights tourism. First, civil rights tourism has real impact, especially on neighborhoods of the country desperately in need of tourist dollars. I mean, we appreciate that here in Philadelphia. Our officials, city officials, do everything they can to draw people to see the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall. But if tourists that come here aren't taught the full story, if they're taught the story that I was taught as a kid, that it was all about virtuous founders creating a nation of equals, they don't hear the whole story. If not supplemented with a complete history, it becomes a distortion. Which is why it's wonderful to hear from, well, Stan has told me about it, and Aisha Richardson, that there are many Black history tours becoming popular in this city, bike tours, walking tours. I encourage you to become a civil rights tourist. If you can, go to Selma and Montgomery, where the poverty is particularly high in Black communities. And this tourism improves the economic health of the area and encourages officials to lure visitors by telling the truth. But second, and most importantly, I want to repeat, my experience was more about inspiration than darkness. Whether touring sites or reading history, it's easy to get mired in the ugly horrors of our past. It's easy to wallow in dark tourism, and it would be easy to make tourism like this all about us, posting lots of selfies to prove our virtue. But that does not honor foot soldiers. It does not raise up those who resisted and died for the cause. So it's like we have to be more pilgrim than tourists so that we can help bring out the best of our country. I mean, of course the darkness of racism is hard to hear, but it weighs heaviest on those whose ancestors were brought to America in chains. They bear the brunt of the anguish. Unfortunately, too many Americans want to deny or minimize the truth, and as a result, they hold our nation back from processing the dark so we can get to the light. I am humbled and thankful and inspired by my trip south and the power of those places. Thank you. Thank you, Seneca.